All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the virtual event space of Green Apple Books on the Park. My name is Casey, and I'm a bookseller here. And before I hand things over to our speakers tonight, and while I'm waiting for everyone to file in, I just wanted to go over a couple of housekeeping announcements for the store. I wanted to let you know about a couple upcoming events we have planned. Tomorrow night on Zoom at 6 p.m., we'll be hosting Mark Anthony Richardson for his new novel, Messiahs, and he will be in conversation with Carolina de Robertis. And also this Saturday in the afternoon at 3 p.m., Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, author of An Indigenous People's History of the United States, will join us to discuss her new book, Not a Nation of Immigrants, Settler Colonialism, White Supremacy, and a History of Erasure and Exclusion. And she'll be in conversation with poet Kim Shuck. So full details for these events and all of our other events, as well as Zoom links, are on our website at greenapplebooks.com/event. And I also just wanted to let you guys know that we're going to be hosting a lot of in-person events again next month. So keep an eye out for those on the calendar as well. And also, if you've missed an event that you wanted to see, many of our events are recorded and posted to our YouTube channel, which is just greenapplebooks.com on YouTube. So with that said, we're excited to welcome our speakers tonight, Jaime Lowe and Hamilton Nolan, for a discussion of Jaime's recent book, Breathing Fire, Female Inmate Firefighters on the Front Lines of California's Wildfires, which I have a copy of right here. And you can purchase copies of it on our website at greenapplebooks.com. We do have signed book plates in them, so make sure to request a signed copy in the order comments, and we'll send those to you. And also, if you have any questions for our speakers tonight throughout the event, feel free to leave them in the Q&A box on Zoom, and they will try to answer any questions you have before the end of the hour. So without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our speakers this evening. Jaime Lowe is the author of Mental, a memoir about lithium and bipolar disorder, and Digging for Dirt, The Life and Death of ODB, a biography of a founding member of the Wu-Tang Clan. Breathing Fire is her third book. She is also a frequent contributor to the New York Times Magazine, among other publications. She has contributed to This American Life and Radiolab, and has been featured on NPR and WNYC. And joining her tonight is Hamilton Nolan, a reporter for the magazine in these times. He has spent the last decade reporting on labor and politics for Gawker, Splinter, The Guardian, and elsewhere. Jaime and Hamilton, thank you for joining us tonight, and I'll pass it off to you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks for having me, and I'm happy to be here. Thanks everybody for coming. Here's the book, Breathing Fire. I would have liked to set it up behind me, but I don't have something to set it on. So everybody, please, if you don't have a copy, it makes a great gift. A little sober, but everybody should buy at least 2 copies, please. Jaime, I've read all your books. I thought this one was very powerful, and it's not really about one thing. It's a book about California. It's a book about fire. It's a book about incarceration. It's a book about climate change. I hope we can touch on all those things a little bit. But first of all, I want to go to the kind of the origin story of this book. It all sort of started with a small out of the way story in the LA Times. Talk about how this story went from that tiny little story into this book.
Sure. I was sitting in my mom's kitchen reading the LA Times, which is the newspaper I grew up reading and was sort of used to reading it every day. And I was reading the California section, which is the B section. And sort of there was one small under 500 word story that was about this woman, Shauna Lynn Jones, who was a female incarcerated firefighter. And the story was about her death. She had died fighting a fire. And there were 2 things that struck me. One was that I grew up, knowing those mountains, knowing the trails, knowing those hills, and I had no idea that the incarcerated fire camps existed there or anywhere else in the state. And it was shocking to me. And I was kind of embarrassed for myself that I didn't know. And, that these crews provided, 30% of the wildland firefighting crews in California every fire season. The second thing that really struck me was that Shonalyn Jones was really presented in one, maybe two sentences, and she was described basically related to her crime. And there was nothing more about her besides where she came from. And I felt like I wanted to know more about who she was before she was incarcerated, what it was like to be in jail for her, what it was like for her family and friends, what it was like for her to go through the firefighting program. And those two things piqued my curiosity. And also I just felt like 500 words just wasn't enough to represent what had happened. And so I started thinking about whether or not I could write something more.
And that turned into a magazine story and then into a book. One thing that also struck me, maybe because I'm also a reporter, is that it seemed like throughout the entire book, you got really good access. I mean, you went and you talked to Shauna's mother, and she wanted to speak to you, and you got all this access within the fire camps, and it seemed like the inmates were open to talk to you. Why do you think that was, and how did you get access that good to prisons?
I was surprised, frankly. You were probably there when I found out that CDCR was going to allow me into the camps, and I was probably a little bit surprised and shocked that they were going to let me. But basically what happened, and this is a little bit of access privilege, I guess. I don't know, maybe that's a little bit ridiculous, but I pitched it to my editor at the Times Magazine, and the stipulations were basically like, sure, if you can get into the camps and if you can talk to Shonalyn Jones's family, yes, you can do this story. And those two things felt like they were definitely big hurdles, but not totally insurmountable. So I think I started calling the Correctional Department in California, CDCR, a lot. And I just didn't stop calling until they let me schedule a time to visit. And then once I had scheduled that time, I was simultaneously writing to Diana, and I, trying to figure out a way to get in touch with her. And eventually we started Facebook messaging, and then we talked on the phone, and she agreed to meet me. And so it started with one meeting, and we ended up talking more. And when I went to the camps, I went several times, and I went to all the camps and the training center at CIW, which is, I think, it's either the largest or second largest women's prison in California. I can't remember. Could be a tie between Chowchilla and CIW, but so I was surprised that they let me into all four. In terms of talking with the women who had both survived her passing and who were in the program, I mean, it just sort of starts with the conversation of trying to get to know someone. And I think that was the beginning. And then however much or however little people felt comfortable talking to me, I was willing to just be there and hear their stories. And I think that this too, which is that people want to tell their stories, and there aren't enough exchanges of what lives are like, I think. And I think that that's usually something a good place to start.
You mentioned, when you first read the story about Shauna, that you didn't really know about maybe even the existence of these fire camps. Do you think that's true for people in the state of California generally? Like, what is the level of public awareness that this entire ecosystem exists?
I can't speak for everyone, but I can try. I think that I've run into
Sure, you
both.
can. Yeah.
Thanks. The people are usually shocked, but there has been more attention paid to this particular labor force because I think it's such an unusual program. And I think it's also sort of this very complicated thing that people are like, wait, in California, there are thousands of incarcerated people who are fighting fires, and the fires are destroying the state. The fires are pretty much caused by, electric companies and PG&E. So there's these white collar criminals who are never, I mean, maybe that's not all of what people are thinking, and I'm just thinking that, but I think people are generally don't know about it. Some people do who, like, lately, I think there's more awareness of it, but hopefully there's even more.
Yes. Now there's more. There's been a book about it. I meant to plug this at the top, but we're going to leave the last 10 or 15 minutes for questions if people have questions. So everybody, please think of a question for Jamie and put it in the little Q&A box, and we'll take a look at those at the end. And I want to touch on California itself, because this is a very much a book about California, and I kind of got the sense reading it of like a state teetering on collapse in some ways. When you think about the future of California, how do you think the future of California is going to be different than the California that you grew up in?
I would say that the contemporary circumstances of California are dramatically different than the California I grew up in already. And I think that, having talked to a lot of climatologists, it's impossible to know based on all the variables how different it's going to be, but I think it's going to be drastically different very quickly, especially if there isn't just immediate change in behavior. Already, it's sort of a guarantee that we're going to have massive catastrophic wildfires every season for the coming 10 years at least. Those same climatologists that were predicting these wildfires 10 years ago are now predicting mega floods coming in 10 years. And so that's the whole Central Valley. That Sacramento is predicted to be 30 feet underwater. We're in a drought, which I think can be classified as a mega drought because it actually started probably closer to 2015. And there was a brief lapse of, tons of water, but it's really difficult to know because of extreme weather. I mean, we're seeing these storms that are happening in landlocked states. We're seeing, obviously that's not California. But I think they, I had to drive up from Los Angeles to the Bay Area and then up the coast. And between, on the 5, which is a fairly industrial highway, the smoke from the fires, the quality of the air was just like, it was a complete haze. There was an orange sun. It was the same type of orange sun that I saw last fall when I was in California. They are just images from an apocalypse. And I don't mean to say that it's impossible for this state to be utter beauty and amazing, because it is. The ocean is still right there. There are these like sea cliffs and amazing birds and life that exists here. That is the stunning beauty of California that I knew growing up, and that I think will continue to exist in some way. But there are a lot of factors that are real scary. I mean, there are entire towns that have sunk 10 to 15 feet because underground aquifers have been sucked dry. And now I feel like a terrible person for anyone living in California because it's scary. I think it's easy to be surrounded by beauty and not really acknowledge some of what could be coming, but it's also, there's a lot of stuff that is definitely different.
And this, I'm a labor reporter, so I'll ask about the labor aspect of this book, which was definitely another thread in this book. I mean, it seems like these women are arguably doing the most dangerous prison labor in America, in a sense. I mean, it's hard to think of another prison labor job that would be more dangerous than this one. Did you get any sense in that the labor movement is thinking about this issue, aware of this issue, concerned with this issue, engaged with this issue?
Yes, and it's their response is very interesting. I mean, one, I would say that I would correct you and say that it's not one of the hardest prison jobs. I think it's one of the hardest jobs, period. I think that when you're putting yourself at risk and you're going into fire, that is one of the most dangerous jobs, period. It doesn't matter if you're in prison or not. Within the prison industries, I also, I think that the circumstances of factory work in the prison industries, and, I don't think there's any OSHA supervision. There aren't any like real watchdogs who are looking after the workers. And so there can be extremely dangerous situations just in the fact that it's prison labor. You're talking about a population that is, surrounded by malnutrition, that has terrible health care. If they're doing anything that is backbreaking work, there isn't, any remedy really provided for it. I think that the union response to it, two things come to mind. One was when I first reported the magazine article, I talked with someone about whether or not they would consider looking into trying to protect, at least raise the wages of incarcerated firefighters. And his response was basically, we're trying hard enough to protect free world firefighters right now and get their needs met. There's no way that we could actually incorporate this other workforce that we don't even really consider to be a workforce. It was a pretty flippant response and something that it just was nothing that he was interested in. The other thing I'll say is that there was a bill passed to have formerly incarcerated firefighters that would make it slightly easier for them to become professional firefighters. It was kind of a toothless bill, and I don't even think that it's enough. It's not nearly enough, but it's something. It's a step in the right direction. And the head of the firefighter union for CAL FIRE came out against it and said that, incarcerated firefighters do not belong in formerly incarcerated firefighters do not belong in professional roles. So they're not just not supportive of unionizing or helping or trying to do something for incarcerated firefighters. They are actively putting up hurdles for formerly incarcerated firefighters.
Did you get the sense that apart from the like formal position of the unions, among like rank and file firefighters, do you think that they have a bias against formerly incarcerated firefighters, or was it more of a mutual support atmosphere?
Say that again in a different way. I'm not sure I understand.
I'm just saying among like regular firefighters, people who are firefighters, do professional firefighters have a thing against incarcerated firefighters, or are they like, come one, come all, we're all brothers and sisters here?
I think it depends. It really depends on the firefighter, and it depends on which level of firefight, like which, whether or not it's forestry versus CAL FIRE versus municipal crews. I mean, I talked to some guys from LA County Fire and they were like, you can't have somebody who's tatted up show up at a house when there's a house on fire and there's a person in the house who would be offended by that. I was having, we were interviewing, and so I didn't tell him I was deeply offended by that statement and sentiment in general. But he seemed very anti that. But then at the same time, there was a supervisor of a Tahoe hotshot crew, which is one of the hardest crews in the nation to be on. And he was a formerly incarcerated firefighter, and he went through all of the different steps. And the forestry department is one of the only ones that actually will hire people with a felony record. And he figured it out, he did it, and he's now in this leadership role. And he actually encouraged one of the women I profiled to sign on to it, and I think gave her some sense of like a feeling that it was possible, that, because I think she felt like she didn't belong within this world until like it was clear to her that she actually had that there was a path that had already been paved by someone else. And then I'll also say that CAL FIRE, these are agencies that have very long histories of discrimination and a lack of equity. I mean, it's almost impossible to be a female firefighter, even if you haven't been incarcerated. It's like a really tough field to be in general as a woman. So I wouldn't say that anyone is like clearly welcoming people, but at the same time, there probably are people who are open to it.
Mm-hmm. It seems like, and you touch on this a little bit in the book too, that there's this natural tension between a mandate to decrease the prison population and increasing wildfires in California and an increasing need for incarcerated firefighters. Is that tension a real thing? And is it a problem?
So I think the main problem is the quote unquote need for incarcerated firefighters at all. I think that one of the things that I felt by the end of the reporting I did and by the end of writing the book is that you cannot be a prisoner and a firefighter, that this program, if people can qualify for it as prisoners, they should be able to do it as citizens, and they should be paid a minimum wage, and they should be able to live in a camp, and there should be social services, and there should be more support. And if they choose to actually be firefighters legitimately, then I think that there's this possibility to create a different kind of program that isn't prison-based, that you can have something like, they have a California Conservation Corps. There's also, a civilian climate corps that I think is being talked about now. And I think that there has to be another way of looking at it, that California needs firefighters desperately, and they should be treated right. They should be treated as firefighters. And the problem with the program right now is that they're out there on the line, putting themselves at risk, and then they go back to camp, and there's the potential to get additional days added to their sentence. There's a potential for reprimands because they're monitored by correctional officers. And I think that job is too hard. It carries too much physical, mental, and emotional trauma and just intensity that you can't be treated like a prisoner while you're doing it. That maybe didn't answer your question.
I think it did. there's not, there's definitely not enough writing and reporting about people in prison, and even more so probably women in prison. Did you find, as you report on all these women who ended up in the same place, what did you find in terms of like the commonalities that got them to where they are?
Of the women, the commonalities of the women?
Yeah, or just the life circumstances. I mean, how did that group of people end up incarcerated?
So I think one thing is that I didn't think of them as a group of people, because I think they all sort of had very different and nuanced things that led them to various different times of their lives. I think that, there were a lot of drug related and alcohol related issues that landed people in jail or prison, and seemingly minor infractions that really could have been, I think, addressed in a way that was more compassionate if we had a society that actually dealt with addiction issues in a healthier and better manner. And that's not even to say that these were all addiction issues. I think that I hesitate to answer the question just because I just don't think I have I don't have the wherewithal to speak as if it was one group. I think that there are many issues that lead to incarceration, but I don't think it's necessarily the issues. I think it's the system that prosecutes the issues and then jails the people, and imprisons the people. I think it's actually this system, this sort of social justice, criminal injustice system that sort of traps a lot of people in a cycle that then you're forever kind of deemed an ex-felon. And so it becomes this cyclical thing.
What did reporting this book make you think about the prison system in America? I realize this is a broad question, but it seemed, there's almost a level of insanity in especially when you talk about the human aspect and the human lives of people in the prison system. It really rises to a level of insanity. Did you have any takeaways at the end of this about incarceration in America and what we're doing out here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you and I have talked about this before, but also I think when I started the reporting, I sort of knew that prison was bad, the system was bad, that it shouldn't exist the way that it is currently. And I think after reading some of the absolutely inhumane and heinous and kind of stomach churning realities of what prison is like, some of the details that women told me were just there are rats crawling over the food in the kitchen, and that there's always kind of correctional officers who are sexual predators. There's a ton of violence, that it's easier to get drugs when you're in prison versus in jail, that it's kind of that, correctional officers will sneak in whatever you want in exchange for sexual favors, which actually in California is sexual assault. When you got into the details, and a lot of times when I there was a variety of ways that the women that I interviewed talked about it. Sometimes it was kind of brushed off as well, that was just what I had to go through. It became very clear to me that prison and jails don't work. They don't work at all. They completely isolate people. They break apart families. They are, I mean, for all the reasons I mentioned before, they're actually terrifying, trauma-inducing places. And I frankly don't understand why reform isn't happening on just an immediate level every day. Like these systems, California, I was shocked with how bad it was. But nationwide, can you think of a good prison? Like, is there a good prison circumstance? Is there somebody who like, and maybe, maybe I'm being flippant, because I do think that a lot of the women I interviewed, and this is where the firefighting program is nuanced, they did feel like what they were doing was good, and they did like this particular program for the most part, and it did feel transformative. But there was no one who liked being prisoners or liked being paid $2.56 a day and $1 an hour on the fire line. I mean, nobody liked getting injured and then having to face a healthcare system that was deemed cruel and unusual by the Supreme Court, and then hasn't, been able to actually function, and yet they're in charge of hundreds of thousands of people's healthcare. And as recently as, I think it's either 2006 or 2016, I can't remember, I think it's 2006, they were sterilizing women, and really against policy and against their knowledge. I mean, there are so many archaic ways that our prison and jail systems work, and they just haven't evolved, and they haven't been forced to. So I think they're bad. That's the answer.
Yeah. You talk about the traumatic aspects of incarceration and how so many people, maybe everybody incarcerated, is traumatized to some extent. And it seems like to some extent the fire camps are a way that people seek to deal with that. But what, if anything, exists within the prison system for incarcerated people to deal with that trauma, and what should or could exist to help them deal with it?
I think nothing to very little. I think that, I was talking with a woman who's in prison yesterday morning, and I asked her if she was, if the programming had started again, because over the pandemic, a lot of the programming shut down, and the programming is like Alcoholic Anonymous groups or Narcotic Anonymous groups or various different, domestic abuse survivor groups. There are a lot of different groups that you can go to within prison, and it's called programming. And I was asking her if that had started again in her prison, and she said they did. And I was like, well, is it helping? And she said, no, I really just do it for the parole board because I want to someday get out of here. And she's been in prison for 23 years on a third strike charge, which means that it was a burglary charge conviction. And she, I think that she feels like she just has to sort of go through it, but that is not helpful. In terms of what would be helpful is not just support in prison and a completely different relationship between correctional officers and prisoners, which is such an abusive and scary situation to be in general. But also a lot more support, like dramatically more support when you get out of prison and you're re-entering and you're trying to navigate this world outside of prison and get a job and find a place to live. And it's really hard when you're on parole. Like, there are so few opportunities. And I think that our system right now is deeply unsupportive. And, most of the women I know who, when they got out of prison, their jobs were, they got them, well, some of them, because they just lied on the application and said that they hadn't been in prison.
Yeah. What, you know, at the end of the book, you sort of revisit what happened to the women after you met them and where they sort of turned out, or where they turned out for the moment. And there's such a range of like what happened to the women, from some, I don't know if any of them are really good, but you know, some almost semi-decent or somewhat close to trying to regain a normal life, all the way to a third strike and back to prison. Was there anything that, what do you think accounts for that range of different outcomes of this group of people that all had the same experience?
I mean, I think people are just all really different. I think there are variables in every life circumstance. I think that, you know, your family support system is really different. Your experience in where you're going when you're released is really different. You know, a lot of the women that I interviewed, I think that sometimes the firefighting training and being in the fires and like it kind of made them determined to never return to prison again. And I think being in prison in general makes you determined not to return, and it's hard. It's really hard. I think recidivism rates are high, and it's because there isn't support upon reentry. But in terms of the range of outcome, I think it's just that people are really different, and they all sort of re-entered into different worlds.
I want to ask about Alicia, I think, who was maybe the saddest, had the saddest outcome, and was the person who ended up getting a third strike and being sent back, and on what was really a very kind of minor, stupid crime. Is there any update on her? Is there any good news? There was like a glimmer at the end of maybe her case was being revisited. Is there any news on her?
So she is at CIW. I think last we talked, which was a couple weeks ago, her sentence was up for appeal. So she's been appealing her sentence. She hasn't heard one way or the other. And she's hopeful that because it has been determined to be a nonviolent crime, that the sentence will be lowered. It won't be, I mean, for people who haven't read the book, the sentence was 36 years to life after a third strike, when she literally broke a window. So this is broken windows policy, like in effect, and realized that the homeowners were there. She ran away. And then later she was like, it wasn't so much a manhunt, I guess, but a couple of days later, maybe a week later, she was caught. And she was, you know, she had a public defender that she didn't really like, I think. She didn't feel like he did a great job. And so it ended up at trial. And she was found guilty, and then she was sentenced 36 years to life. I feel like I'm trailing off, sorry. Not focused here, but she's, you know, she's in prison. So whenever I talk to her, she's always has this kind of like cheery attitude. She's like, well, I'm here, it is what it is. She got transferred from one yard that she felt like was really scary, where she had gotten into a huge fight. And then she had, you know, because CDCR has terrible healthcare, she had to have a surgery, and then she had a blood infection from the surgery, and she was basically, she had COVID. She she went through a lot, and then because she had this surgery, she went to the kind of infirmed ward, which was mostly older people, and she felt like she could help out and just kind of wheel people around and assist in that way, and not be with kind of a population that felt like she was getting into fights with a lot. So she said last time I talked to her, she was happier in that yard and doing better. And I'm hoping to visit her in a couple days. So I'll let you know. Everyone on this call.
All right, good. Have any of the women in fact read the book, and have you got any feedback from any of them?
Yeah. I had a few. I'm trying to think of who hasn't checked in. I think I haven't heard from Selena, and Whitney is like currently fighting fires. She is like on fires. So I don't know if she's had a chance to read it, but Sonia, Carla, Marquette, they all read it. I sent Alicia a paperback copy because you're not allowed to have hardcover copies in prison. So I don't know if she got it yet. It often takes a long time. They also probably won't let it through, in all reality. But I've gotten nice.
Did they like it?
Yeah.
Were they excited? Okay. We got a few questions from the audience. Let's go to a few of these questions we got here.
Yeah.
I will ask you the questions. First question from Vicky. And you talked a little bit up front about how you got good access and how the people wanted to talk to you, but were you met with resistance from employees and inmates at the prison? Did you get resistance and pushback also in the course of your reporting?
It's a good question. In terms of anyone who was incarcerated, I left it up to them. You know, anyone who didn't want to talk to me was like, that was 100% fine. So that wasn't an issue. Like, I never want to interview somebody who doesn't want to be interviewed, and they weren't forced to, you know, and if they felt uncomfortable talking about anything or at any point didn't want to continue with the conversation, or just said, you know, I told them, don't talk about something, or tell me if you want to stop at any point. And they were all very open. And I can't think of like any deep resistance. I mean, a lot of the women were incredibly open and generous with their time. And, you know, I'm really super grateful for that, because I don't know why people do talk to me. I feel really lucky that they do, because I like hearing about their lives. So I didn't find much resistance from any incarcerated folks, but and resistance from employees, it was interesting because I think that you know, I think there were like the correctional officers were, you know, they actually, you know, took me on tours of the facilities, and they sat me down and fed me food that was made by incarcerated people. They were really proud of the fire camps and wanted to talk about them. So the press person was like kind of busy looking for other jobs. And so I think sometimes when, like, she was literally scrolling the openings within CDCR while I was there. And so I was sort of felt like, well, she's not super concentrating on me, and that's a good thing. And there was, you know, one moment that was like a lack of resistance. That was, I think, a really, really lucky moment, which was when I was on the fireside the first day I was at Malibu. And once I was on the fireside, there were no there weren't any CDCR press people there. And so I got to that side, and the LA County fire press person hadn't arrived yet because he was actually on a fire. so I was just walking around and I was looking at the memorial to Shauna, and a couple of the women from her crew came up to me to talk to me because they were like, clearly knew I was some weird entity at this camp. And they just started telling me about, her death and witnessing it and who she was and what it meant to them. And so, because I had made an agreement, like it wasn't a formal agreement, but I basically told CDCR that I wouldn't ask about the death because they said that the women were too traumatized. And I thought I would be able to just circle back with her mom and try and figure out what had happened from outside means. And, when Carla in the book, who is actually Jessica, she's since come out and sort of said she's okay with her name being out there. And another woman started talking to me. It really became such an important part of telling the story. So in some ways it was like the opposite of resistance. It was wanting to participate a lot. Thank you for that question, Vicki, and happy birthday.
Yeah. Questions are pouring in now, by the way. Here's a question from Terry M. Sounds like somebody who knows something about wildfires. In Florida, we do prescribed burning to prevent wildfires. Will California be able to switch to prescribed fire to prevent these catastrophic wildfires and have the incarcerated women working in less dangerous, more controlled burning situations? Or is climate change too far gone to put prescribed fire on the grounds?
Great question, Terry. And having known that you have done prescribed burns and worked with wildfire, thank you for what you do and all that you know about wildfire. Incarcerated firefighters will never be doing prescribed burns. They will never be in charge of holding fire. I think the CDCR barely lets them lay hose. They are really hand crews. They really are on the ground cutting containment line, and they're up there clearing brush. They're doing a lot of that on the ground dirty work. And I think that CDCR, because they have very little faith in humanity, would never give, they'll give people a chainsaw, but they won't give them a canister with oil and fire. And so I doubt that that would ever happen. And I think that, California is trying to shift to some controlled and prescribed burns. And there's a lot more talk about how, native populations here, actually have always done prescribed burns in Northern California. I think one problem is that CAL FIRE is this huge bureaucracy, and it's a monolith that is in charge of many, many, many different ecosystems. And, you'll have people in the Sierras and up north where prescribed burns are absolutely essential to consider and to figure out how to do them, and that devoting the resources is essential going forward. And that's one of the problems, is one season there'll be enough money to do prescribed burns, and then 2 seasons following that there won't be a budget for it. And so all of the grass, all the shrubbery, all of what was burned will kind of grow back and then not be managed. And so there has to be a consistent long-term plan, and they really haven't set that up yet for prescribed fire. The situation with multiple ecosystems is that, down south, there's chaparral is not really a great type of growth to use prescribed burns for. And so sometimes CAL FIRE looks at things as a one size fits all thing because it's one big bureaucracy. And I think it would be great if there was a way to kind of address the different pockets of California. And your last question is one I've thought a lot about, and I'm not a climatologist and I don't know, but it often has occurred to me that it is quite possibly way too late, because it's really, it's one thing to look at the past of how prescribed burns worked and how they were effective, but now we're dealing with different variables because we have higher temperatures, the drought, we have, these bark beetles, which are eating through trees way further north than they ever have, which just leaves these like drought-ridden, sad trees that are just fuel for more fire. And so there are all these other things. And then there's also the fires themselves, which are creating weather systems, which then affect the state and affect how fire works here. So I think my answer to that question is I don't know, and it's terrifying to think about.
All right, we got a few last questions we'll get through in the last 10 minutes here. Question from David N. We've been hearing more and more about fires in California in recent years. Has the firefighter program been increased in size as a result?
So that's a great question, David, and thank you for it. The budget has increased. I don't think it's increased enough, and they're actually trying, one of the things that the budget, so California had a ton of extra money last year. And so Governor Newsom did devote a lot to wildfire, but a lot of it is also going to just, bail out a lot of the electrical companies like PG&E. A lot of it is about, trying to kind of repair infrastructure and clear brush and is preventative and not necessarily staffing issues. One issue is not just about California, but federal crews are having, a crisis in terms of trying to fill the actual crews. There are empty positions in California because they only pay $13.30 an hour to fight fires. So you're out there for months at a time doing grueling work. And again, this is the free world crews. These aren't even the incarcerated crews. Who are not getting health benefits. They're seasonal employees, so they're let go in like April or May, and the USFS is not adjusting to that. They haven't figured out, they're losing a lot of really talented people because it's just not sustainable as a career. And like for your body, the health risks that a lot of firefighters are going through mentally and physically are enormous. So it's and the other point that I was going to make to this is that there were more seasonal firefighters hired last year because of the pandemic, but the reason they were hired was because incarcerated crews couldn't actually go out on the fire line because of a fear of COVID within the prison system, because the prison system had dealt with the spread of COVID so poorly that the state could not actually field incarcerated crews. The lack of incarcerated crews, all of a sudden, Governor Newsom found money to pay for seasonal employees for CAL FIRE that otherwise the money hadn't been there whenever it was brought up in legislation that incarcerated crews should be paid more. Thank you for your question.
All right, 5 more minutes and we'll do the last 2 questions. Here's an anonymous question. What is it like to try and promote a new book in the days of COVID?
It's hard, but it's also kind of, you do what you can. I'm grateful that I got to publish a book, and I feel really, really lucky that it came out, and I feel really supported by this particular, people have been responding. And so it's a different kind of response because I really do feel like I love to be able to go out there and talk to human individuals a lot and hear what they have to say and hear their questions in person and have like a real vibe in a room. And that's no offense to everyone here. There is a real vibe in this like weird virtual ether room, but I do love being in a bookstore. And so that's one thing that's lost, but really that feels like the only thing that's missing, and that there's a lot that's gained, which is that this world now exists so seamlessly on Zoom and I think radio and TV is much more adaptable to kind of access people and authors, because it's easier to just kind of fold them in, and you don't have to be in that city or have to be in studio or nearby. And so in some ways it's easier to talk to some people about the book, harder to do it in person, but it's been great actually, which is maybe a bad thing to say because it's, we're in this time of COVID and it's bad.
No, it's good. And it got very good reviews. The final audience question from Sue E. Can you address any aspects of the women who are mothers? What can you share with us about their relationships with their kids and how they're managing now?
Sure. I think so Sonia, who had, all of her kids went into foster care when she was imprisoned. It was devastating for her. And that was one of the aspects of being a firefighter that was especially hard, because she would be out there fighting a fire and hiking, and she would be thinking about her kids, and then she didn't know what was actually happening with them, and she had no contact with them because that was part of the court order, was she had to be separated, and there could be no visits or communication. And I met her in Malibu. We've kept in touch since then, and we were supposed to do a radio program together. And she texted me that morning and said, I'm so sorry, I can't believe this is happening, but I can go to court and get custody of my kids. I can see my kids, but I have to go to court to do it. And they just told me. And I was like, dude, like, that's such fantastic news. And it's so amazing that you're gonna, legally be able to see your kids again after 6 or 7 years. And so I think that being a mother was just really, it was really hard for her to be imprisoned and away from her kids. I think she felt like she really grew as a person, but that she didn't want to be separate from her kids at that point. Carla / Jessica is her real name. She ended up giving birth when she got out of prison, and I saw her actually right after she gave birth and met her daughter, and it was, her talking about motherhood is always funny, and like she seems to really love it, and her daughter and partner. And I talked with like Selena, she once told me that she felt like she loves her kids, and you can hear them screaming in the background sometimes, maybe not screaming, but talking loudly. And at some point she said, being in fire camp was way easier than being a mother. I think sometimes I want to just go back there. Not to be a prisoner, obviously, she was joking. But, and one of the things that was most striking about this book was talking with Diana. And that's not so much, she wasn't a woman who was incarcerated and was a mother, but she was a mother of an incarcerated woman. And she lost Shauna Lynn Jones on the line, and it forever affected her and her life. And I think that, I only met her after Shauna passed away, but I know from how she talked about it that it was something that was just absolutely life-altering and devastating and traumatic in a way that is unknowable.
All right, and I'm going to ask one final question. It's almost time for us to say goodbye, but on the way out, for people who read your book, and I imagine there will be a lot of people who read it and want to feel an impulse to do something about these issues, or somehow help these women in some way, somehow address this, what can people do?
That's a tough question, actually. I mean, I think that being incredibly vocal about prison reform is where I would start. I think that the book deals with a lot of social issues, so you could pick any probably, and it might be covered, and like figure out a way to educate yourself, get involved, and if you have a lot of money, donate money. The There are tons of programs that deal with reentry and anti-recidivism and awareness. I think that, I would start with saying abolition and not thinking of it as a scary word, thinking of it as a word that is actually possible, and that you need to figure out how we can live in a future where these atrocities, which are our acceptance of prisons and jails, that we don't live with that, and that the people who are inside of them don't live with that, and that their families don't live with that. I think that we have to envision a future where that doesn't exist in the way that it currently is. And I know you're asking for specific action, and I'm not sure exactly what that is, but I think that, education is the beginning. And if you do get the book, there's a list of books in the back, and several of them cover, prison. They're a lot more they're more in depth about policy, about, the prison system in general. I think start with that, and then there are a lot of, then look into organizations that are nearby. And I can, email me. My email is on my Twitter, and I'll recommend something.
There you go. And we're a few minutes over, but with that, I'll kick it back to our host.
All right, thank you guys both so much for that really informative and interesting conversation. And thank you to everyone who left questions and added to the conversation as well that way. I wanted to, oops, can you guys hear me all right? Sorry, I forgot to hold my mic. I wanted to mention again that Breathing Fire is available for purchase on our website, and we do have some signed copies available at Green Apple, so you can buy it at greenapplebooks.com and make sure to request a signed copy in the comments. It's a great way to support Jaime, who has so kindly spent the evening with us tonight, and also to support our event series. So with all that said, thank you, Jaime, thank you, Hamilton, and have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you. Thank you so much for hosting
Thank
this.
you.
And Hamilton, thank you for doing this. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Good night.
Good night.